Hi, I'm Lane at Liberty Oilfield Services, and I'm here to talk about my other favorite model. Now, my other favorite model is a back-of-the-envelope model, and it has equations that show or govern fracture growth in a very simplistic way, in this case for a radially growing fracture. The graph on the left shows you a typical injection. It shows a typical mortar injection or a defit with a long pressure decline following it, and in that pressure decline we can determine closure. Once we determine closure, we can calculate back what the net pressure was at the end of the job and what the slurry efficiency was at the end of the job. Two important parameters that we're then using in the following basic equations for radial fracture growth. The two equations I'm using here are conservation of mass, the equation on the top, where the total frac volume, basically epsilon times V, is equal to the product of its dimensions, which are driven by the equations that I'm showing you here. And then the second equation is the overall fracture width. The fracture width at the wellbore is provided by Snedden in an equation in 1946 for the simplification that the net pressure along the fracture is the same everywhere. That gives us an equation like that. When I combine then these two equations, you can actually see that we can solve for both the radius and the fracture width independently through the equations that I'm providing to you here on the right. That's our simple back-of-the-envelope model. Simply solves for the fracture radius and the fracture width with two equations and two unknowns. Now, I'm not going to stick with this. I want to make it slightly more complicated, but I still have it all in the back, on the back of an envelope here. Slightly more complicated, and we'll explain to you why it's more complicated and maybe a little bit more useful than our very simple radial model. Now, the first thing that I want to make a little bit more complicated is the fact that the fracture now has a length and a height and a fracture width instead of a radius and a fracture width. So we're incorporating in the conservation of mass equation three individual fracture dimensions: half length, height, and width. Now, the fracture width equation is slightly different as well, because I'm using a fracture width coupling coefficient that's somewhat variable and that can account for composite layering effect issues as the fracture grows over different heights. Typically, we can calibrate this particular parameter through the calibration process. And then finally, the parameter that we're using in an additional equation is the ratio of the half length, or the ratio of the total length to the height, and I'm calling that coefficient alpha in this particular set of equations. But I can now do basically the same thing as what I did before. With these three equations, I can independently solve for the fracture half length, height, and total fracture width that we're generating using just 7 parameters that I'm using here that we can measure around the frac job or from the rock that we're fracking in. Now, what are these 7 parameters? Same thing as before: net pressure at the end of the job, efficiency at the end of the job, that we determine both of these from the closure pick that we make from a defit, the volume of fluid that we pump during the frac job, epsilon times volume pumped is equal to the frac volume. And then another parameter is the width coupling coefficient gamma. Then we have a parameter that actually combines two parameters, two rock mechanical parameters, the Young's modulus and the Poisson's ratio, as described here in the equation below. That's what we call the fracture opening modulus, or E bar. And then finally, we have the fracture shape factor again, alpha, that we defined before. Now, alpha, typically, from lots and lots of fracture mapping projects that we've been part of, as a rule of thumb, you can start with an alpha of about 5, meaning that the total length to the height of a typical fracture, if you don't know very much else, is maybe about 5 as a starting point. As you can see in the graph on the right, the actual length to height ratio may be quite a bit different, but 5 is a reasonable start. With that information and the equations, we can simply plug that all in a spreadsheet, use the 7 input parameters that I just defined to come up with an output. And often we use it the other way around. We vary some of the input parameters, especially the width coupling coefficient and the alpha, based on fracture mapping data of where we know what the fracture half-length height are and what the average width should be given volume balance for this system. So we have 7 relatively easy and simple to measure inputs that can easily be plugged in a spreadsheet to give you a rough idea of how volume changes, for example, affect fracture growth. Now this is, in summary, my favorite Frac model. It's simple and it uses very simple diagnostic feedback. It has its limitations, but it's still much better than a complex model that doesn't use any feedback at all. For other fracture modeling challenges, please contact us at libertyfrac.com. Thank you.